I guess, a lot of people go into non-monogamy just, even though there's so many resources now, still kind of unequipped and having a lot of misinformation in their head and kind of wondering why everybody at the party says it's, this wonderful thing and why they're struggling behind closed doors.
The requirement here is not to necessarily agree or disagree with what you and I are saying, but to do the self-inquiry, to sit with this knowledge and go, how does this information impact me? What does this mean for me as I go through my life and consider how I want my relationships to be and where did these values come from for me? How did I come to even hold the values that may or may not be your own?
I agree with you. And it comes down to really looking at what consent is. Consent isn't just saying yes. Consent is really understanding the factors involved, really, and this is, when you understand all of these dynamics, then you can say yes or no to things like non-monogamy from a truly informed place. And your yes is more likely to be a true yes if you do decide to say yes to non-monogamy.
I'm Cindy Darnell. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, personal, cultural, scientific, political, and other lenses, and unpack and explore your erotic quandaries with the world's wisest erotic philosophers. Welcome back to Season 4 of The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we explore life, sex, and modern relationships with some of the world's wisest erotic philosophers. My name is Cindy Darnell. I am a sexologist, a sex and relationships therapist and coach, and of course, I am the host of The Erotic Philosopher. I am also the author of Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, The Truth About Mismatched Libido and Rediscovering Desire. You can find out more about me at my website, cindydarnell.com. Before we jump into today's interview, I want to tell you about a project I'm working on, my online subscription community, where you can learn more about the issues that we tackle here on The Erotic Philosopher, be they relational, personal, emotional, sexual, and so much more. So many of us need help and support making sense of sex and our relationships and our complicated lives these days. So this new online community serves as a portal to learn more from me, but also from others as we dive into the issues that are most important to us in creating meaningful lives and fulfilling sex. You'll see more on my website, cindydarnell.com, under the community tab. Today's guest is Kate Loree, a sex-positive licensed marriage and family therapist with a specialty in non-monogamy's, kink, LGBTQ, and sex worker communities, and she's the author of Open Deeply, a guide to building conscious, compassionate, open relationships. In addition to her master's in marriage and family therapy, she also holds an MBA and is a registered art therapist. She is an EDSI certified sex educator. A reminder that EDSI, Everyone Deserves Sex Ed, is the certification program run by Anne Hodder-Ship, who you met in episode 4 of this season of The Erotic Philosopher, and an EMDR certified therapist with additional training in the trauma resiliency model for the treatment of trauma. She's been a practicing psychotherapist since 2003. She co-hosts her own sex-positive podcast, Open Deeply, with Sunny Megatron. In this episode, Kate and I dig into the work of relationships, and she offers insight into how we can show up better in our relationships, including how to manage triggers during communication and what to do when a situation feels dire and hopeless. Enjoy this enriching discussion with Kate Loree. Kate Loree, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher. It's lovely to finally meet you. I've been following your work for years now, actually, now that I think about it. I've, on the social media. But this is the first time I've actually been able to have a face-to-face with you. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm honored to be on. You have a great podcast. You're putting wonderful material out into the world, and it's so important.
Thank you. It's lovely to have that affirmation. And it's one of the things I love actually doing about this podcast is actually getting to meet and talk to the people whose work I have admired, either up close with people who are my actual, immediate friends, and then people who are my colleagues and associates from around the world. And you're one of them. So I'm really chuffed that you could be here today. And so before we get into our discussion today about your fabulous book, for people who are not familiar with you, Kate, what would you like them to know about you?
Well, let's see. I think in keeping with what we're talking about today, I'm just going to say a little bit about my personal life. So, my book is about non-monogamy. I had, in my younger years, I had an 11-year monogamous relationship. And then when I came out to LA, I was kind of scooped up fresh off the boat, practically, like right off as soon as I landed, by the person that I'd end up being with for 13 years. And he was the one that proposed non-monogamy to me one day when I came home from hard days at work, working in clinics while I was still in school to get educated to be a therapist. And, I remember he had like a video on his computer. There was a picture of a woman with her legs spread, provocatively posed, like looking out, and she had a smile and he had a smile, and he said, "I have an idea." And that's when he proposed non-monogamy. And I was very much the scared one. I was the one that was really nervous about it. When I first heard about that, I was just like, if people find out, it'll mess up my reputation as a therapist. Like, I had all these ideas in my head. And then, here we are, a good 20 years later, and non-monogamy is something that I still embrace and has brought me so much happiness in my life. And I've been every iteration, every type of non-monogamous you can think of, and I've experienced all the joy and all the pain of it. And at this point, I'm older now. And so the way I operate in my private life is in a very fluid way, and I very much operate from a place of compassion and almost looking at non-monogamy in a spiritual way, in a sense, like coming from a very, like really making choices from a place of kindness and understanding, people have attachment injuries that get poked and all of this. And so I'm all about patience and kindness in my private life. And that's more important than, cutting to the chase and just understand the humanity of people. And so, I have a much, when I was younger, I had this, wild non-monogamous life where we were having parties once a month at our house. And we were kind of like the general pattern of swingers in the beginning, where we would very carefully hand select people that came into our life, and it was very active. And then we went from that to poly, and now I'm just way more low key and more focused on travel and spirituality and that sort of thing. But still identify as non-monogamous, just a more gentle version.
And I like that you can sort of mark this trajectory that you've experienced across, 20 years. And mine is quite similar to yours in that way also. I think what I noticed for myself in particular is, as I have gotten older, I am much less inclined to get knocked around by stuff that in my 20s and early 30s would have really been devastating to my, attachment experience of still, I think, passing out the narratives that had been embedded from monogamy culture around, you have to find the one and all of this kind of stuff. And that as I think matured and grew into my own edges and recognized that actually, for me personally, the struggle toward maintaining this, what I call a Disney narrative of relationships, was so utterly excruciating for me, that to now be, as I am on the other side of 50, and feeling so much more like you, settled in myself. And it's not even about having this kind of wild, amazing life or a wild, amazing sex life. Even I definitely don't have that anymore. I probably did once upon a time, like you, but I don't have that now, and that's okay. That's actually part of the growth, So I guess, if we start there using our respective experiences of this, and for people who are listening, who are, beginning a non-monogamy life or are, well into it like us, 20 years in, some of the most common struggles that people can experience as they begin to come to an awareness that perhaps non-monogamy is actually going to be something that they embrace for a period of time or perhaps for the rest of their lives. What do you notice are the things that folks will struggle with at any age in the initial stages?
Well, I think a lot of times, I could talk on this question for literally weeks. But, when people come into non-monogamy, a lot of times they have seen more of the bright, shiny version. Maybe they've read some stuff about, yes, jealousy is a thing, but very rarely have they really understood, just that non-monogamy pokes at our unresolved attachment injuries way more. And so many people, whether you're non-monogamous or monogamous, are having more unconscious reactive relationships, meaning they are unaware to the degree of whether unresolved attachment injuries are triggering them. They don't really understand triggers. And then when their body gets dysregulated, they're yelling at their partner and they're having these arguments in which both of them are not what trauma therapists would call in their resilient zone. And so they end up in these heated conversations, which end up not going well. And if we can just, reel that back and learn how to ground ourselves, understand how non-monogamy pokes at your injuries, and then learn how to ground each other. There's so many things that can be tweaked and go down differently. And this runs so much deeper than just, I have jealousy issues. Even the topic of jealousy, I always unpack that suitcase, and inside jealousy is all these other emotions, and sometimes people aren't even experiencing true jealousy. They're actually experiencing feeling disrespected, but they're using the word jealousy, and so I guess, a lot of people go into non-monogamy just, even though there's so many resources now, still kind of unequipped and having a lot of misinformation in their head, and not wondering, and kind of wondering why everybody at the party says it's, this wonderful thing, and why they're struggling behind closed doors.
Yeah. So let's kind of back up a little bit. Just, I think the folks who listen to this podcast are going to be familiar conceptually with attachment, but let's do a quick kind of 2-minute description of what you're talking about when you say attachment injuries. How might someone know if they are in the grip of what you would refer to as an attachment injury?
Yeah, well, again, if we think about attachment injuries, as you said, probably already, people already know that maybe if you've had abandonment in your childhood or, or any kind of abuse, these things might be attachment injuries. Within non-monogamy, when something happens, maybe your partner goes out on a date for the first time, or your partner doesn't check in frequently enough at the play party or what have you, and you have a reaction that you in your own mind are like, wow, this is way beyond what is warranted in this situation. Like, what's going on? I should be maybe upset at a 3 or a 4. Why is my whole body reacting at like a 9 or a 10?
Right. So that's a real marker of where it is not just a response to something that your partner is or isn't doing, but it's like the response is almost disproportionate to what is occurring between you.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good way to tell. And a lot of people know that. They've, lived their life and they know the difference. They know when they're having a response that in their mind is proportionate to what is occurring, and whether they are just like just like in their, they'll use language like losing it, right?
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah. And so once you start to notice those things, then you can get in touch with what was happening in that moment. What was the antecedent? What was the thing that triggered you? And then sometimes we can get connected to what we were looking at, what we were experiencing in that moment, what we noticed in our body. Maybe we feel a knife drop in our gut. Maybe we feel when we get in touch with that knife drop in our gut, maybe we notice some feelings of heartbreak or sadness. And then if we can connect to that somatic and emotional feeling and bridge back into our past and see what pops up, a lot of times something will just pop up that may be wildly different. The original thing might be getting upset at the play party, but it may bridge back to your parents ignoring you and paying attention to your sister more than you, or something like that. That's wildly different. And now you kind of understand what's getting triggered. And now you can have a shot at working on that.
That's one of the things I think, when I first started doing this work myself, just in a sense of like personal development, not even in the context of romantic relationships, but being able to make the connection between something that happened to me as a small child, and perhaps not even remembering a very specific incident, but having a memory of having felt a particular way as a child, and then being, fast forward into my mid-30s, feeling that exact same way, but in a therapeutic context, being able, talking about it, and in my head trying to make the connection to the thing that happened when I was a small child and saying, well, no, it's completely different. And it took me a long time to realize that the work of this, of passing out the original pain to the current situation, is not that the context is the same, but that the emotion is the same. It took me years to make that connection, because I was thinking, no, but I don't feel like that about, such and such, or the situation's totally different. No, it's not the same thing at all. But it's not about replicating the context. It's about replicating the feeling.
Yeah. And the body sensation.
Yeah, that for me was a real breakthrough, being able to, and for me, I always felt it in my stomach. You're right. And now, and it still happens. So I think, I'm curious for you around when we're working with this. My position is that this is not necessarily about getting rid of these experiences, but learning how to be with them in such a way that they don't fuck us up nearly as much.
Yeah. And who we're dating matters, right? Because like, imagine that we decide to be vulnerable enough to tell our partner, like right now, the situation that's going on right now, I feel this knife drop in my gut. I'm feeling, sad and anxious, and I'm still making sense of it. Now, we can have a partner that reacts in a variety of ways, right? We could have a partner that catastrophizes, which even kind people will catastrophize and just be like, well, I don't even know why we're trying non-monogamy. Clearly you can't do this. When really it's just like, there's just something going on specific to the moment. It does not mean that the person can't be non-monogamous. So that's one thing, is catastrophizing. Another person might go hyper logical and just be like, okay, well, you've bridged back and you realize that this is a childhood thing. So you just need to cognitively override this and realize that was the past and this is not happening now. And a lot of times that cognitive override ends up feeling very invalidating. It can work sometimes, but sometimes it can be incredibly invalidating, especially if it happens over the course of the relationship, where you're constantly just using a cognitive behavioral layman's approach. And you wonder why 10 years later you have generalized anxiety, generalized anger, or a numbness in your body. And it's because you may be saying yes when it's not a true yes, and powering through it from a cognitive behavioral lens, rather than really owning that this is where you're at. And, there may be extra steps that are necessary besides just a cognitive behavioral override to help you negotiate a hard moment.
I absolutely agree that, a choice of partner can really go a long way with this. And not that the partner needs to take on the role of a therapist at all. They don't. In fact, I think it's better if they don't. But that a degree of, compassion and a degree of self-awareness on both sides of the fence is so fundamentally useful, that being able to know oneself, and going back to what we were talking about earlier, that I think, getting older, you end up knowing yourself a little bit better. Well, some people do. I think not everybody does. But if one has done a degree of work on themselves and they know themselves a little better, my personal experience has been that this part does get easier. But still, for folks who are mature, who haven't really done a lot of, emotional self-inquiry, erotic self-inquiry, relational self-inquiry, that inclination to want to defend or push back or minimize a partner's experience can be, it can be really devastating. If one is triggered, having a moment of being really activated by something, and they're really, feeling pretty fucked up in a very specific moment, say at a party or their partner is about to go out on a date with somebody else, and the partner, and you say to the partner, I'm feeling freaked out, I'm feeling upset because of ABC, and the partner's response is, it appears a little cavalier, or it appears a little insensitive. What might we do, the triggered person, in order to be able to hold and contain themselves until there is an appropriate time to readdress this with the partner who most needs to hear this?
Yeah. Well, I definitely believe it all starts with the body. So, if your partner is leaving, or they're unavailable, or you can't have a, conversation. So in other words, you can't think of them as a source to help you get grounded, and now it's shifted to being completely in your court, then, it depends on the situation. If you are at home and you don't have other people that are there interrupting you, you can really focus on trying to ground your body, whether it is deep breathing. Deep breathing is one of the nicest hacks that tricks the body into believing that you are in a safe place, and you can do it at the gas station, you can do it in front of people, and they won't know. And it can help you get from being in your sympathetic nervous system into your parasympathetic. That's usually a place of calm. Other things you can do is put a weighted blanket on yourself, or focus on any kind of positive resource, a positive resource, or pet your kitty or your dog, like for me, a grounding exercise is just going on my porch and saying, I'm blessed with a beautiful view with hummingbirds, and my kitties come out there, and I can just take in all, that's a million different positive resources. And then notice what part of my body knows about that positive resource. When I see the hummingbird, my heart is open and feels warm, and I focus on that. And I focus on my gratitude for that. And that triple layer cake of focusing on gratitude and resources and linking it to the body helps ground the whole body. When you ground the body, then your brain starts functioning better. Because when you are dysregulated, for instance, the prefrontal cortex that negotiates between reason and emotion isn't working so well. And so that's why the next morning you might wonder why you called your girlfriend a cunt or something, the night before, or, wondered why you don't even remember the conversation. It was probably because you were dysregulated. Nothing good comes of trying to power through a disagreement when you're dysregulated. But if you do take the time to regulate yourself before, when you're dealing with uncomfortable feelings, either at home or when you're in a discussion, now your body's grounded. It shifts your emotions oftentimes, to being more reasonable and less catastrophic. And then your thoughts change. and your thoughts become more clear and again, less catastrophizing. And you start to be able to know how to help yourself, because a lot of times when you're in that really triggered place, if you were to ask that person, how old do you feel? A lot of times their answer would be something like 8 years old, 10 years old. So they're in this mental place where they really feel like they just want someone to take care of them. They don't really know how to take care of themselves. And so if you're able to ground your body, then you can, or you're more likely to be able to start pulling yourself out of it.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing I think about being so activated, like that sense of powerlessness, like everything is just slipping through your fingers, and that, it can be so helpful, as you say, to remember in the present that you might feel like you're 8 or 10 years old. But to remember cognitively, I guess that's the cognitive part of it, is to say, actually, no, this is 2022 and I am an adult and I have the capacity to, get resources. And often one of the things that I suggest to people is also to remember that community is a resource. And for me personally, one of the things about unpacking monogamy values, even in a non-monogamous context, is that we might not necessarily see our community, our friends, as people who are of equal value to us, that we still tend to privilege and prioritize romantic partners above non-romantic friends and partners, which for me personally, I'm a real advocate of throwing that idea completely away, because, to really, for me anyway, embracing the real value of non-monogamy is almost, I take a somewhat sort of relationship anarchist position on this, that we can actually have multiple meaningful relationships with people, whether we're having sex with them or not, that the presence of sex is not necessarily a marker of what makes a relationship valuable, and being able to turn to others, especially if one of the partners who is, the catalyst for you having a moment is unavailable for whatever reason. That's certainly something that I do tend to rely on quite heavily, is networks and community.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of studies that say community is one of the secrets to happiness, or one of the most key things. And, and so I think when we start to break down the rigidity of how we look at relationships, and we start to move more towards a relationship anarchy stance, then we build a stronger safety net. So as you said, if one thing falls away, one person falls away, you still have this net of other people and resources to fall back on. And also, I mean, just from a kind of a spiritual lens, I think the more we operate from a flow state, the more we are able to let people or events flow into our lives that can help us. If you think about it, the more we're operating from a rigid place, either professionally or in our romantic life, like say we decide to be monogamous, or say we decide to stay with the job, even though we're miserable, and we're just rigidly adherent to that job, it's like there's all these opportunities that we just don't even see, or that don't even have the ability to flow into our lives, because we're rigidly holding on to certain things.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of The Erotic Philosopher as much as I enjoy bringing it to you. I love being able to introduce these guests from around the world to you, and in return, it would help me enormously if you would go to Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts and leave The Erotic Philosopher a rating and review. Your labor there helps this podcast land in front of people's eyes and ears, and what better way to help create a more inclusive and supportive world than spreading more information to more people? And you'd be doing a great favor to me too. If you would like to find out more about working with me, head over to my website, that's cindydarnell.com, where you'll see my offerings as a therapist or coach for a streamlined and personalized service, plus my online pleasure school under the online courses tab, where you'll find a suite of pre-recorded classes ready to go. There's something there for everyone. You'll also find my online community under the community tab, where you can join me and others just like you navigate the topics we discuss here on The Erotic Philosopher, and so much more. There's no shame in needing support to better understand these complex parts of our lives, and I am here to support you every step of the way. We're also on Instagram and Twitter at The Erotic Philos. That's PHILOS. You can also follow me on social media. I am at Cindy, CYNDI_DARNELL on Instagram, TikTok, and on Twitter. Thanks for joining us here today. And now let's get back to the episode.
So let's sort of pivot at this point and talk about, the other side of this, which is the communication piece and being able to learn how to communicate, which is so much more than just talking. There's the talking and the listening part and being able to be competent at both sides. And so in your book, you have the EPIC communication model. Talk us through what that is and how it works and like how you came up with it.
Okay. Well, it's very much a blend of Harville Hendrix imago dialogue and, somatic psychotherapy. I'm very influenced by the Trauma Resource Institute and their trauma resource model, and with a dash of maybe Buddhist compassion on the end. The thing is, there's all these lovely communication models out there, right? Like the imago dialogue, like nonviolent communication, but none of them say, oh, by the way, if you're dysregulated in your body, none of this is going to work, or it's going to be greatly impaired. Right. And
they really don't, do they?
And guess what? When people need it, it is when they're in these states, or potentially in danger of getting into these states. And so, the EPIC model, it's not linear. So, know that. So the E is the emotional, which is the empathizing part. The P is the physical, which is the grounding part. The I is the intellectual, which is the validating part. And the C is compassion and action. A lot of times people want to fix it at the front end, but, the compassion and action is looking to see how we can make things better on the back end. Now, as I mentioned, the P is the physical, the grounding. Although it's the second in order, it's actually something that would happen all the way through a hard conversation, and so if you are in a setting like, say, that's easier, say at home, and your partner says, I want to have a hard conversation. If you already know this model, you can already set the stage where you help your partner get grounded, or you take a moment to ground yourself, and I don't know how much you want me to go into this. I can use a whole example to explain it.
That would be great. Yeah, why not?
Okay. So, so imagine Veronica and Mark had a play party the night before, and Mark was in the backyard making out with Sarah. And while they were like voraciously making out with each other, he tripped over Veronica's garden gnome that her great grandmother gave her, and he broke it. Never said a peep about it. This was a very sentimental object. She loves her great grandmother. This is the only thing she had left from her great grandmother that is deceased. They go to sleep. They wake up the next day. He goes to work. Still no text, no mention of it. And Veronica is just fuming. He comes home at the end of the day, very tired. And she says, I need to have a hard conversation with you. And she's already done some deep breathing. She's done a little bit of yoga or so, or whatever she needs to do. She's already
I notice I'm feeling anxious just hearing about it. I'm like, oh, shit.
Yeah, she already knows that she's pissed at him, right? And so she's done what she can to kind of ground her body. And he's like, okay, well, he had just walked through the door. So he's like, let me change my clothes. I'm going to go to the bathroom, put down my briefcase. And while he's doing all that, maybe he does some deep breathing, or maybe, he does some self-talk, where his immediate thought is all the stressors that happen in the day, all the reasons why he's been kind of removed, because he knows that she's mad about something, and he knows that he's been removed lately, but he doesn't know exactly why she's mad. And so he's in his head, he's getting defensive, and he's like, okay, cool your jets. That's not going to go well. We've learned about the EPIC communication model. Okay, deep breathing, clear your mind. Let's try and be supportive of Veronica. Let's remember what we know, And so he does some self-talk and deep breathing, and he gets himself, and he changes clothes, goes to the bathroom, and walks out there. sit on the sofa. From the very get-go, now he's focusing on her. He can already see that she looks tense. She's got the scrunchy face between, the crease between the eyebrows. And he just looks at her and just says, is there anything that I can do before we get started to help you feel calmer? And, and perhaps she just said, maybe she's not so mad that she can't make an ask like this. And she said, can you just put your hand on my knee? Or she asked to have his arm around her, or maybe even they go to the bedroom and he's the big spoon while she talks, right? So you can imagine right now how this is already going down very differently, and she starts to speak and she says, you know how much I love my great grandmother. You broke my garden gnome. I'm so disappointed in you. You're a better man than this. I'm angry. I really feel lonely in this because I haven't heard from you. And she goes on. And then he steps in with the emotional part, the empathizing part, which is the emotional language. A lot of times people go to heady statements. This is the emotional language. So using things like, happy, mad, sad, glad. In this case, she's talking about how frustrated she is, etc. And so he starts to try and mirror back as much as he can, right? Like, I'm hearing that you're very disappointed in me. I'm hearing that you're feeling lonely and left. And he tries to repeat as much as he can. And then he said, anything else? And, and again, this is all very imago dialogue stuff, and she repeats back, or she lets him know anything that's missing. He tries to pull out as much as possible. And so, and then at this point, after he says, do you feel like I'm getting everything that you're feeling? Right. Then at this point, when she says yes, they may again kind of look and see where they're at. Are they still grounded? Right. Maybe he notices that he's getting a little bit tense because, again, he knows why he was not at his best self. And so, again, he's like letting go of some tension in his body, making sure he's relaxed in the sofa because he knows that she'll pick up if he's getting tense, right? And then he goes to the intellectual piece. So there's the E, the P, and now the I, which is the intellectual piece, which is the validating piece. So, again, and he might say something to her like, I intellectually understand why you're so upset about this, because your great grandmother meant so much to you, so it's just, and again, this part is similar to imago dialogue, and she may come back with, and he might say, is there anything else? And he's like, well, you didn't even say anything all day long during the day. You could have texted me, etc. That heightened my anger, and he may repeat that back. So now we have all of that, right? And so once she feels seen and heard, they may move to the C, the compassion and action, where he might say to her, is there anything that I can do to make this better? Is there anything that I can do to help in this situation? Is there anything that would make you feel that I am compassionate in your situation, right? And she might say, well, yeah, on Yelp, there's a garden gnome fixer. There's a guy who can fix the garden gnome. It's right down the street. I would, if you get that fixed, I will feel better. And he's like, done. I'll do that. And so maybe at the very end, again, they go back to the grounding piece where, they might, look at each other. He might say, is there anything else I can do? And she might say, well, I'd just really like a hug. Now I'm not going to go into the whole bit about switching the emotional talking stick, but let's just do something super short. Maybe when they pass the emotional talking stick, this is the place where the person that has been listening can actually derail everything, right? If they're not careful. And so it's very important that you're in your higher self, your grounded self before you start to speak. And maybe he does say, look, I know that I failed you in this. I got laid off at my job today. I'm really terrified of what's going to happen. Last night I was super tired and I just crashed. That's my bad. But during the day I was so I'm just so scared that you're going to think that I'm going to fail you. And the only thing that I ask is not to give up on me, you know? And maybe they end it and she's like, no, we always work our way through things. We'll be okay, you know? So this is how it's different than something like imago dialogue. It's just grounding all the way through with compassion and action and some kind of plan at the end.
Yeah. And I love that model. Just let me say that straight out of the gate. I think that is beautiful. And even as you were giving that example, I was imagining myself in both roles, actually, in her role and in his role, and just thinking about how, you know, the absence of often, you know, the absence of the compassion piece, especially when we are activated and triggered, and how when all of those pieces can be put into place, what makes it possible then for people to reconnect. And that's not to minimize the hurt that was caused necessarily. It just creates a container for partners to move through discomfort together without it having to mean the end of anything or the beginning of something else, that it can just be a blip. And when I say just, I don't mean to minimize it, but that it's, you know, if it's an isolated incident that's happening like that, then we can work through it. If there is a pattern of one partner being neglectful and disruptive, then that's obviously going to be a different issue entirely. But the meaning that you know, stuff's going to come up in relationships and friendships and all kinds of relationships. I guess even monogamous relationships are going to have issues like this. And so these tools can be used to create and cultivate connection when a breach of connection has happened.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you and your practice, but in my practice, so oftentimes, you know, and these are really bright, open-minded, progressive people. A lot of times they come into my practice, and when they first start to have a hard conversation, they do something that I call lawyering up, where it's almost like they have their invisible paralegals next to them and the big stack of proof as to why they're the injured one and they're the correct one and the right one, and they just go at it. And so as soon as you add some of these components, the grounding piece all the way through, the empathizing, the validating, then all of a sudden it starts to break down this lens of treating relationships as, you know, as war and starting to switch to love as, you know, as a relationship having to do with love rather than war.
Right. You know, and that love piece is the practice, that it's not just a thing that you wear on a chain around your neck. It's something that we do as a long-term, something that we hold as a value, I think, is really the essence of it. And that is really hard to do, certainly at the beginning, where, especially if we've not grown up in families and cultures and communities that have privileged and prioritized love as an activity, as a verb, rather than something that is an obligation that you do because, you know, this is your husband, or this is your parent, or this is your somebody, and you have to love them because that's the rule, with no demonstration of what love is. I think a lot of people perhaps don't really even know what love feels like until they've actually started to unpack, when have I felt loved? And simultaneously, when have I felt unloved? And how do those things feel different somatically?
Yeah. I mean, I think from the time we're little, we are taught a narrative of love that's incorrect. You know, I think Bell Hook's book, All About Love, is so crucial because she, right out the gate, she addresses that, you know, that there's so many things that we're told, you know, is love that is not love, you know. So,
and that can be, you know, that's our work to do, I think, as individuals, is to start having that textured relationship with, you know, what love means to us, especially in a fight or a disagreement, especially when there may be a tendency to want to win or to want to be right. the implication that if I don't win or I'm not right, then I've lost, or that means that you're right. And when we get trapped in that black and white thinking about relationships, it can really be very corrosive to the love part, to the connection part, to the reason that we think we're going to be in a relationship in the first place.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of us don't really have a lot of positive affect tolerance for intimacy. All you have to do is go to a basic Tantra class and watch, a group of 30 people pair up and do the hand on heart, eye gaze together. And you'll watch a group of adults all of a sudden get giggly and wriggly in less than a minute. Why is that? Because we don't have the tolerance for intimacy. And so when we don't have the tolerance for intimacy, we don't have the tolerance for love. And then we unconsciously put bombs underneath our love, even though, it's like what we want most and what we fear most is the same thing oftentimes, which is love. And it's like, once you start to realize that, you can build your positive affect tolerance in these ways, like a muscle at the gym, and you'll be much less likely to lawyer up in an argument. You'll much more likely be able to validate and empathize and ground your partner if you have a tolerance and really can lean into love.
Yeah. And it really is, it's a lifetime of work. And, coming back to the attachment piece, that I think one of the things that I see on social media, in particular Instagram, where people talk about attachment styles like they are star signs, that they're a permanent part of who you are. And, I love being able to talk about this with guests, to say, we can, attachment is something that is developed over a series of experiences, and that we do have the capacity to develop a different set of experiences if we're willing to put the work in. And as you said at the top of the discussion, if we have partners who are good for us in that way, to have that shared value around being willing to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a really good point that, so often, especially, with polysecure coming out, and all of that, there's a lot of talk about attachment styles. And I think a lot of people, as you said, don't understand that this is something that can change over a lifetime, and it can change depending on what partner you're involved with,
Right. It's not a personality trait. It's a contextual thing depending on the person you're with.
Right. And I think it's just something that's like this loose, model that can kind of help you look at relationships. I mean, I talk about attachment styles in my book, but really just to kind of give that framework that allows for a bigger conversation, not for us to get all rigid and being like, well, this is my attachment style, and so this is how I'm going to act across my life,
Yeah. And that when we present our partners, primary partners, or however we do our non-monogamies, as being, attachment figures, that they're not necessarily anymore to our attachment figures, and we are our own attachment figures, to be able to create secure context for us by learning to recognize what's happening within us, learning to ask for what we want, learning how to show up for other people, even if we don't feel like it at the time, but doing it because our higher value is to live a life of love. And sometimes that means having to do stuff we don't feel like doing, but because ultimately we decide that it's meaningful, therefore we will show up anyway, because our higher value is, no, I'm going to demonstrate love. This is how I like to do it. And that's the maturity part, I think, of growth.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of times you'll hear the word work applied to relationships, but I honestly think if you reframe that and you look at getting to know your lover and loving them well as something that's a gift, like you get to love them well, you get to have the opportunity of loving them well, rather than work, that can be a big reframe for a person, and some people might think, listening to this podcast, well, everything that you're saying, wouldn't it apply to monogamy as well. Everything that you're talking about, attachment injuries, all of this. The reason it's such an important it's so important to talk about this within non-monogamy is that, as I might have said, non-monogamy folks that are attachment injuries more than monogamy, assuming that the monogamous relationship, the people are being faithful and they're not cheating, which is a big if, right? But if it's just two people, it's like you can go for a decade thinking that you're healthier than you are because none of this stuff is getting poked as it does in non-monogamy with your partner having other lovers, etc.
Yeah. And that's, I think, a really important distinction that historically when monogamy had been commandeered as, the normal way to have relationships, as we are starting to unpack that and say, actually, no, that's a social value. It's based in, a lot of religiosity and patriarchal structures and economic structures even. And then for people who make decisions to do relationships differently, however that looks for them, that I agree with you that being monogamous and therefore immune to having the bear woken up, as it were, does not necessarily make you a more well-rounded, robust, healed person, especially if you've never had to address and confront some of this stuff, and that it's normal to have, shit flying around when you're feeling tender and vulnerable. That's the point of it on some level, I think, also.
Yeah. And I know some people listening to this might be like, well, isn't this evidence that monogamy is actually better? Like, why can't we just be monogamous and not have to deal with this stuff? And I think that's very much I come from the standpoint of I'm not going to mess around with a particular model. If it works for you and you're happy and all that, I'm not going to mess with that. But I would invite people to really look at things because, monogamy does put you in a pretty tight box in a lot of ways. And there's so many things that don't get to flow into your life when you're monogamous, and so much learning and growth that you don't get to have when you're monogamous.
That's right. No, I agree. Yeah. And I think, obviously, for folks who are listening to this, being wherever they are on the relationship dial and the relationship spectrum, this is not to say that everybody should be non-monogamous necessarily.
Right.
That's not the deal. But when we make decisions to be monogamous or otherwise without having done any self-inquiry, I think for me, it's the absence of self-inquiry that I find unsettling, because just because something has been spoon-fed to us doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be the healthiest option. It's there are lots of reasons why these styles of relationships have been sanctioned and commandeered by institutions. I'm thinking governments and these sorts of things, around economic structures, around migration, around power, around who gets to bring their spouse into this one country and who doesn't, based on their orientation, their genitalia, what they do in bed, allegedly or not, all of these things that, if you have been privileged enough, I guess, to never be affected by any of those things, then, more power to you. And that does not mean that you are immune to the fragility of the human condition that actually investigating matters of the heart brings up for all of us when we want to explore how deep we can go.
Yeah. And on that note, I imagine a lot of your listeners have already read things like Sex at Dawn that talk about how the agricultural, revolution and some right-wing forces, either politically or in the church, have, are very much about ownership, right? Like owning people, owning land, et cetera. And that is a byproduct of, monogamy is a byproduct of all of that, and on the flip side, or going further, really, when you look at sexual shame, those trying to dominate have either consciously or unconsciously known that if you can instill sexual shame, you can puppeteer a person, a community, or a country. you know. I think one thing that I noticed when I went into my private practice, and here I am, this fringe therapist that has some of the most open-minded people in California come into me, and yet still I'd have these clients riddled with sexual shame. And what I noticed was that they didn't just not trust themselves regarding sex. Yeah, there was a sexual piece where they were like, well, if I just allow myself to do whatever I want, I'm going to become a monster. It went further than that, where they didn't trust their judgment or their internal compass in areas outside of sex. And that's when I realized, oh, this is why this is such a powerful political tool, because it just and usually what's interesting is it's the church that instills the sexual shame. And then when the person doesn't trust their own internal compass, they go right back to the perpetrator, so to speak, the entity that instilled the sexual shame for guidance, the church again, and that's a bit of a mindfuck, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's that powerful, let's tell people there's a problem and then we can offer them a solution model in action that is actually thousands of years old. And again, the requirement here is not to necessarily agree or disagree with what you and I are saying, but to do the self-inquiry, to sit with this knowledge and go, how does this information impact me? What does this mean for me as I go through my life and consider how I want my relationships to be, and where did these values come from for me? How did I come to even hold the values that may or may not be your own?
I agree with you. And it comes down to really looking at what consent is. Consent isn't just saying yes. Consent is really understanding the factors involved, really, and this is, when you understand all of these dynamics, then you can say yes or no to things like non-monogamy from a truly informed place. And your yes is more likely to be a true yes if you do decide to say yes to non-monogamy.
That's right. That's right. And I think too, there are going to be people listening who perhaps, depending on where they are in the world, may not have the privileges or the options to come out as such, as non-monogamous, and that this is not necessarily as cut and dried, I guess, as just saying, fuck it all. I'm just gonna come out and live my life, and there'll be no consequences. For some people, they can be dire consequences, and this is always a nuanced conversation. And coming out is going to be a really individual process, and it's not something that just happens once. It's something that happens over and over and over. And we go out, we come in, we go to the side a little bit, and it doesn't end, actually, I think.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people do think of it in that binary way. It's like I'm either in or out of the closet. And I remember way back in my 30s, I was down in San Diego at a conference, and I was talking to a gay psychotherapist that works with non-monogamy, and it was just a vulnerable conversation, and I wasn't out of the closet entirely at that point. I wasn't, and for whatever reason, I was a little bit tearful when I was talking to him, and I'm like, I feel a little guilty because I'm, here you are, I'm talking to a gay man. I'm sure your coming out process was way bigger and harder than mine as a non-monogamous person. And he's just like, Kate, he basically said, you don't have to do a pain comparison, and any non-monogamy, any coming out process is hard. And he was so kind about it. And, you can slowly come out over the course of your life. I like what Elizabeth Sheff says about coming out, where she invites people to ask the following questions. Is it appropriate? Like for me, I didn't come out to my mom for a long time because I didn't know if it was appropriate, because she's elderly, she's in a small town, and I thought it might be harmful to her health. I thought it might, upset her. And so so is it appropriate? Is it necessary? Like some swing lifestyle people, they don't need to come out because they're not in love with anybody. They're not thinking about bringing them to the holiday dinner, right? So it may not be necessary. And then is it safe, which is what you touched on, it's like you might be in an area, you may still be living with your parents or something like that, where if you come out, they might kick you out of the house. Or if you come out in a small town, you could risk being beat up or harmed in some way, losing your job. And so, these are all things to think about. But when you do come out, if you are, blessed enough to be able to come out, I think there's a lot of blessings that come with that. I mean, personally, in my journey, just the more my insides matched how I presented to the world, the happier I became.
Yeah. And that's a wonderful place to be able to operate from a place of congruence if it is something that is accessible to you. As a North Star, that can be a lovely place to sort of start trudging towards, even if you don't fully get there. Keeping that as a guide can just soothe a ragged nervous system and an anxious heart. I think that can be a lovely thing. Kate, we are going to have to wrap up our discussion here. I could keep talking to you all day and all night. Where can folks get your book, Open Deeply? Where is the best place for people to buy it?
Well, first off, it's available in all three forms, Kindle and audiobook and paperback. You can get it wherever books are sold. If you decide to get the paperback, please buy it from a local bookstore. Let's support our local bookstores. But you can go for the big ones like Amazon. It's basically available wherever books are sold. And as far as finding me, probably the best place to find me is on Instagram, Open Deeply with Kate Loree. I'm also on TikTok, but very, I'm not consistent on TikTok. I need to work on that.
Yeah, me neither. I'm very hot and cold with it.
Yeah. And then my website is kateloree.com. So that's LORE.
Great. And so the links to your website and social media are going to be in the show notes for people who want to follow up there with a direct link. And I really appreciate your time with us today, Kate. And I look forward to spending more time with you, maybe in person sometime when I am over on the West Coast at some point in the future.
That would be lovely. If you ever want to get lunch or get some drinks, I'm completely game for that.
Gorgeous. I'm sure we'll make that happen. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.